Hey everybody. I just wanted to give this kind of a test run. So this is the section that I asked you to check out at home, um, but we're going to run through it today via this kind of lesson and see how it goes, and make sure you can hear me and see me and all that good stuff. And you're welcome to ask questions via the discussion board. Moving on from this. So the situation we have for today is classical versus Keynesian economics, and who says what, and who wins and who loses, and what do we use today, and how all that works. So our two major players today, well, really there's three, but we're going to start with Adam Smith, who of course wrote The Wealth of Nations, and John Maynard Keynes, who really grew to prominence during the Great Depression and after. His way of thought really gets most of its attention post-mortem, or after he dies, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So you know how much I love to put these in here and not talk about them, so I'm going to continue with that. So prior to the Great Depression, most everything was, let's leave it alone. Let the markets have their day, and we're just going to really see what happens. And then, of course, 1929 happens, and we have this whole situation where nobody really knows what to do. Hoover was the president at the time, and his situation was, hey, let's just let it be, and let's see what happens. And, of course, we all know how that went. And so FDR, of course, is elected in 32, and he has a very different approach to what should be done. So that whole laissez-faire kind of attitude, of course, means let the markets do what they're going to do. The invisible hand will take over. That's a very Adam Smithy kind of thing. The invisible hand will guide the markets back to equilibrium. And in some cases, that's true. But I think what's interesting is when the markets really turn, and in today's society, what's actually happened with the coronavirus, if the governments didn't get involved, who knows how far things would go. So that's a discussion for another time. So the invisible hand, of course, means just to let the markets figure it out over time, and we'll see what happens. Before the Great Depression, government spending was roughly 10% of national output. Today, it's actually about 35%. So government spending is every single thing that the government spends. So like if the government needs paper, well, they have to buy paper. And that's government spending. And jets and rockets and nuclear weapons, those are all part of government spending. So the size of the military, government programs, entitlement programs, roads, all of those things are going to be grouped into this. And of course, as our nation and population increases, then of course government expenditures are going to increase. A fun rule of thought that I always like to fall back on is no politician is ever going to ask the government for less money. Their districts are always going to be seeing or wanting to have an increase in expenditures. So it's really an interesting thing to see that governments usually never really reduce their spending. Maybe sometimes they'll take in less taxes and move towards deficit through government borrowing, but they're never going to ask for less money. Good. So the general theory of employment, interest, and money is the most famous economic book out there. It is by far the hardest book I've ever read in my life, but John Maynard Keynes published this right in the heart of the Great Depression. And he was in talks with many leaders around the globe about what to do in this situation and what it looks like. And he was a visionary in terms of what the government should do in massive slowdowns of the economy, and what they should do if the economy is overheating. And he is really the mantra of the government has an obligation to step in and help the economy get a boost or a jump start when it's failing or when it's slowed down. So he focuses his attention on the whole or aggregate spending, especially from the government perspective. What can the government do to increase that consumption factor in our expenditure model through either tax cuts or government expenditures. So what should fiscal policy look like is really where he emphasized his time. So he solely said if we can adjust people's incomes, then we should do that and consumption spending will grow. And what's the one way that government can affect your income is, of course, by taxes. So he is a huge proponent for increasing disposable income during economic downturns. So this is the man right there. That's John Maynard Keynes. He has a phenomenal mustache, I would like to note. Excuse me. So he, of course, observes that disposable income increases, consumption will increase. So, of course, this is going to say that during downturns that he is going to want to reduce personal income taxes. And so the fallback to this is understanding that the marginal propensity to consume and save are always going to be a factor. He is of the assumption, though, that if we can increase disposable income to a point, especially in economic downturns, that people will increase their MPC, or the marginal propensity to consume. So it's an interesting play where we saw during the 2008 downturn that people generally saved more because they were uncertain about what was going to happen in the future. So the two curves that you see in front of you now are drastically different. I want you to pay very close mind to what the classical view does with the short-run aggregate supply curve and what the Keynesian view looks like. And the important denotation here is that the classical view disregards the short run entirely. And it's a very important thing. And it basically says that aggregate demand is going to cause price changes regardless, that all prices are fluid and flexible at all times. So please note that in that realm, it is under the assumption that wages are completely unstuck, that they will move directly with classical forces. Whereas the Keynesian view brings in that notion of sticky wages and sticky price levels. And if you smash the two together, you really get the model that we work with in AP Macro, where that short-run aggregate supply curve becomes in the classical view, that short-run aggregate supply curve becomes the long run, and the Keynesian short run maintains itself with those sticky wages. And so in macro that we learn is a molding of the two. It's kind of we shove those two together and say, well, this is really where the economy sits. There are times where the markets need to be left alone, and there are times that the market needs to be adjusted from the government. And that's really where most of the economies sit today, and most governments sit today, is there's a time and a place to let the markets live by themselves, and there's a time and a place where the government needs to get involved. So the third guy, who I mentioned just a little bit earlier, his name's Milton Friedman, and he's a really interesting guy. And there's a lot of folks that really abide by him, and in fact, the Fed follows Milton Friedman's kind of teachings, where he says that if we can control the money supply, if we can increase the money supply by X percent, then the economy will follow suit with that. His assumption was anywhere from 2 to 3% increase in the money supply annually would increase GDP by the same notion. And in large part, he was right, is that you can adjust aggregate demand by adjusting the availability of money. As you've seen in previous units, if we increase the money supply, aggregate demand would increase. And if those monies are applied to capital accounts, then we'll see long run growth. So he's not entirely wrong. So his teachings really shape what the Fed does in terms of targeting interest rates and targeting growth via increasing the money supply through any of the three monetary policy tools. What's really cool is today the news just broke. Yesterday the news broke that the Fed was buying at a minimum of $500 billion worth of government treasury. So their open market operations increased by $500 billion I'm very interested to wait. I'm still waiting to see what they're imagining the money multiplier to be, and they eased the discount rate to nearly 0%. It's 0 to 0.25%. So right now they're very, very close to that zero bound kind of model where it's going to be interesting to see. And Quinn asked a question yesterday, like, is this a good thing? Well, I want to ask you that question. What does the government, what does the Fed have left to do? What else can they do? If the interest rate's put to 0%, what can the Fed do now? They can keep buying bonds, but how many of you want to go out and take a loan out right now, not knowing what, I mean, shoot, we can't even go to work. We can't go to school. So what are we going to do? What are we going to borrow the money for? It's really interesting in places like Ohio and Illinois that are telling restaurants that they can't take people. And other states are telling restaurants that they can't have any more than 50 people in the building at any time. So it's a really interesting kind of shake on the economy. This is unprecedented, what's going on. So here is, of course, Milton Friedman. He is a glorious looking man and pretty smart guy himself. And this brings us full circle to the velocity of money situation that we have. You're very well familiar with this equation, MV equals PY. We're going to use PY now. I've always been taught PQ, as I mentioned before in class, but both are correct. And this is the scenario where Milton Friedman's theories live. So it's saying if we increase the money supply, that real GDP is going to have to increase by the same ratio, or some combination of price and output are gonna match that. So at least technically, his theory is true. Excuse me. So this graph really explains or shows what happens with that velocity of money. So from 1960 to 2009, we had a major expansion in some years of the amount of money in the money supply. And so from 1960 really to 1980, you see that nice gradual increase of the velocity of money. And then we see some major jumps in the 90s into the 2000s where we really see the access and availability of electronic funding via debit cards and credit cards being accepted more widely. And of course, the age of the internet only moves that forward even at a faster rate. So we're going to really stop on this page right here. My picture may be blocking the last little bit right here. But this is really the holistic approach to what works and what doesn't work. So is expansionary monetary policy helpful in fighting recessions? Yes, except in special circumstances. And what my question is, and what I can't wait to see what happens, is are we in that special circumstance right now? Like, is this really where we're at? And I think it is. So is expansionary fiscal policy effective in fighting recessions? Generally, except for the monetarist, of course. Of course, the classical said no for everything because they just want to leave the markets alone. Keynesian Economics says that we need to affect everything, that the government and the Fed should be able to have an effect on every aspect of it. The monetarists really only like monetary policy. The modern consensus is really where we live for our class. So can monetary fiscal policy reduce unemployment in the long run? As we've proven time and time again, absolutely not. So should fiscal policy be used in a discretionary way? Interesting. No, except in special circumstances. So what are those special circumstances? Are we in those special circumstances now? Well, who knows? Folks, it's been fun talking at you for a little bit. Please ask questions in that discussion board if you have them. Have a great day.